In the year 1790, South Carolina's coast was drenched in wealth and shadow. The Bellamy family was admired as visionaries, their plantations overflowing with riches, while others barely scraped by. But behind the grand mansions and glittering feasts lurked something darker, a brotherhood that thrived on secrecy, fear, and blood. Their fortune was not just built on land and labor, but on whispered rituals carried out in the dead of night. What did this dynasty worship in exchange for their millions? And how many lives were destroyed to protect their secret? The Bellamy family were not unlike other powerful dynasties of the South. Their estate spread across fertile Carolina soil, built upon enslaved labor, tobacco, and rice. To outsiders, the Bellamys seemed untouchable, a name spoken with reverence and envy. They hosted banquets that dazzled visiting politicians and merchants, painting themselves as the very model of Southern prosperity. But to those forced to work their fields, the truth was far more sinister. Whispers spread among the enslaved. Children who vanished without trace, masters who gathered under the cover of fog, and nights when torches lit the swamps not for harvest, but for ceremony. The patriarch, Jonathan Bellamy, was obsessed with control. His wealth was his shield, but it was never enough. He believed he had found a way to make fortune permanent, through rituals bound in secrecy. While other plantation families fought droughts and debt, the Bellamys seemed immune, as if their fortune grew even when others failed. And so, the myth of the dynasty was born. The Bellamys presented themselves as chosen, destined for greatness. Yet every enslaved worker knew that power came at cost, and the price was often paid in human suffering. What began as whispers of cruelty would soon become undeniable signs of a cult that valued wealth above life itself. As the years passed, the Bellamy's fortune only grew, even when others lost everything. Crops that should have failed in storms somehow thrived on their land. Rival planters who challenged them found themselves ruined, debts unpaid, families disgraced. But it was the enslaved community who noticed the true horror. Children disappeared most often during harvest season. Mothers cried into the night, their wails swallowed by the swamp. No one dared speak openly, for those who questioned too loudly were the next to vanish. One story spread of Isaac, a boy no older than 12, who had been taken from the slave quarters after dark. His mother searched desperately, but his body was never found. Days later, workers reported seeing torches deep in the marsh and hearing chanting that chilled their blood. Soon after, the Bellamys announced yet another expansion of their land, richer than before. The enslaved began to understand. Their labor built the dynasty by day, but at night, something else sustained it. Rituals that required innocence. Rituals that consumed those who had no voice. Meanwhile, white elites of South Carolina turned a blind eye. The Bellamys' wealth flowed into politics, keeping them powerful and protected. To admit the truth would mean questioning the very foundation of Southern prosperity. Yet cracks appeared. Some workers whispered of marks carved into the skin of those found dead in the fields, symbols that resembled nothing from Scripture. Others claimed to see Jonathan Bellamy retreating into the swamp with robed men by his side, carrying objects that glowed under moonlight. The cult's grip tightened, and with it, the enslaved endured a terror beyond bondage itself. The knowledge that their lives could be stolen not just for labor, but for ritual sacrifice. The Bellamy Dynasty was not just rich. They were untouchable, fueled by a secret cult that turned suffering into fortune. The breaking point came one storm-stricken night. Rain lashed against the fields, and thunder drowned the cries of those shackled in quarters. But from the swamp came a sound louder than the storm, a chorus of voices rising in eerie unison. A group of enslaved workers, driven by grief and desperation, followed the glow of torches into the marsh. What they witnessed would haunt generations. Cloaked figures stood in a circle, their hands raised toward a crude altar of stone, and upon it was the still body of a child, one of their own, surrounded by offerings of blood and gold. Jonathan Bellamy presided over the gathering, his voice steady, as if the storm itself obeyed his words. With each chant, the workers felt both terror and clarity. The wealth that made their masters invincible was bought with lives. The enslaved fled before they could be seen, but the truth could not be forgotten. That night became the unspoken climax of the Bellamy Dynasty's cruelty. For the enslaved, it was confirmation of what they already feared. For the Bellamys, it was proof that power could be protected at any cost. But storms do not last forever. Though the Bellamys tightened their grip, the whispers grew louder. Even in silence, the enslaved carried the story, passing it down as both warning and memory. The Bellamy Dynasty endured for decades, their plantations flourishing while others crumbled. To the outside world, they were a model of Southern aristocracy. But to those who survived under their rule, they were a symbol of how greed, racism, and cruelty could be sanctified under the guise of power. Though the cult's rituals faded from public record, the trauma remained etched in memory. Families carried the weight of vanished children, and generations spoke of the nights when the swamp burned with torchlight. The true horror of the Bellamys was not just their secret cult, but the way society allowed it to exist. Wealth protected them. Whiteness shielded them. And those who suffer were denied voice, justice, and history. Today, when we look back at stories like the Bellamys, we must ask, how many fortunes were built on exploitation, so deep it bordered on the unspeakable? How many voices were silenced to preserve dynasties celebrated as great? The legacy of the Bellamy Dynasty is more than a Southern ghost story. It is a reminder that behind every empire built on slavery lies not just cruelty, but rituals of dehumanization that stretch beyond imagination. The question that lingers is this: what hidden costs still remain in the wealth we celebrate today?